with whom we do cooperate on within many projects. He comes from the New Europe Center, a Kiev-based think tank. And as I said, he will be presenting his findings when it comes to the assessment of the security challenges that the Ukraine faces. Then we are going to have 5 discussants who are going to reflect upon what was said, but of course they will have freedom to kind of provide their own comments and reflections. So we will have Riho Nizhnikau, senior researcher from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Helsinki. We will also have Batu Kutelia, also a good friend of mine and a colleague with whom we worked quite extensively during our stints at the government. He's nowadays the vice president of the Georgian Atlantic Council. We will also have Sorlia Ratskova, and I hope I pronounced the last name the right way, please forgive me, who is from the Globsec, research fellow there from Bratislava. We will have Stanislav Secriero, whom I know for a very long time, and he will provide his view coming from Paris, but with a lens that he himself will attach from his own background. I'm also looking forward to that. Unfortunately, we don't have Dmytro Shulga, who was not able to come, and that's really unfortunate. And we will also have Rosian Vasiloy, also coming from Chisinau, security analyst from the IDIS Peter. So I'm also looking forward to this discussion. With that, I would like to ask Leonid to start his presentation, and it shouldn't be, I guess, more than 10 to 12 minutes.
Thank you, Irakli. Ladies and gentlemen, indeed, Irakli mentioned that the paper was not distributed to you, but we'll have the opportunity to do this actually after this event. So please feel free to share your comments or anyway, ideas in writing. I have a difficult task to speak about security environment in Ukraine, because it's very difficult to embrace all the aspects of this complex situation which we have in Ukraine these days. And I would like maybe only to highlight some of the points. I won't be able to have a big presentation of the complex security situation, but I would like to highlight a few points which, from my view, are these days very important, and then of course we can discuss. First of all, I would like to underline a trend which is ongoing in Ukraine, trend of increasing the group of so-called neutralists. Ukraine is a big country, and often the mood in Kyiv is not the same as the mood in, let me put like this, in Odessa or Kharkiv or Kherson or any other region in Ukraine. Therefore, for the last years, we observed that there's an increasing pace of an increasing group of neutralists in Ukraine, which is somehow gaining traction among the Ukrainian public opinion, and is somehow raising the questions about to what extent these people are still supporting the European integration. But I think this also has a threat which is connected to the security environment. So just to give you an example, in 2013 in Ukraine we had 22% of people who are neutral, who don't opt for any of the geopolitical, let's say, integration project, EU or Eurasian Union. This number includes also a small number of those who are not decided. In 2018, this number rose to 33%. And the most disturbing issue is that at the regional level, we have especially issues in, for instance, in Kharkiv or Odessa, where the majority of the population does not support the European integration, unfortunately. I mean, we have the rating group and IRI opinion pool, which shows, for instance, that Odessa is the most Eurosceptic region. We have 50% of population in Odessa region being against the EU, and only 24 supporting the EU. Of course, there are various opinion polls, but all of them are pretty much showing the same numbers. And I think this is one threat to the European integration security situation in Ukraine, because there is some fragmentation of, let's say, cohesion of Ukrainian society towards the external threat. And what is even more disturbing about certain regions is that, for instance, again, Odessa, because it's the region where I've been quite recently, and I've been doing interviews there, is that the many people in Odessa, opinion leaders in Odessa, don't feel Russian war in the East as a real threat. They say, look, the war is happening over there, and we are here. So it's far from us. We are more concerned, they say, with Transnistria being so close to us and the Russian army in Transnistria than with the war there. So I think this is a sort of adoption, not adoption, but a partial adoption of the Russian narrative in terms of how close the war is and how serious is that. Second moment I wanted to underline is the transatlantic unity. That's something which is being discussed, I mean, quite often between EU countries and the US, especially recently. But and at some point we thought it will not affect Ukraine in a way, because, you know, Ukraine is something where there should be no, how to say, different opinions from US or EU countries regarding what's happening in Ukraine. And indeed, there is no different opinion. However, there are issues which are somehow dividing the transatlantic unity, and I'll give the example of Nord Stream 2 project. You know, the gas pipeline project Nord Stream 2 is somehow facilitated by EU companies, certain EU countries, and is not welcomed by the US. And the issue is that, for instance, from a Ukrainian perspective, Ukraine would like US to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2, so it could not take place, it could not become a reality. But also from a perspective of a Ukrainian position, we cannot say this, because in that respect, we will have to spoil our relations with Germany. Yes, because if US will impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2, it is likely that Germany and other countries which are involved might retaliate. So this creates a potential issue for the transatlantic support for Ukraine when it comes to very concrete projects like Nord Stream 2. But there might be some others as well. One moment I think which is the most important currently in Ukraine is the next elections. The next elections are scheduled, presidential elections are scheduled for last day of March 2019, and the parliamentary elections are scheduled for autumn 2019. And I think that at this point, this is the biggest concern when it comes to Russian influence, because we see attempts from Russian side to mobilize its supporters basically in Ukraine. For the sake of clarity, I'd like to mention that officially we have about 15% of Russian of the Russian-led project, I mean, in Ukraine, of the Eurasian Union, 15%, about 15%. The numbers are varying again, 12, 15, 16. This is not much, but this represents a force. And the second issue about this number is that this is not, in my opinion, this is not the real number, because many from the neutralist group, which I mentioned at the beginning, are actually considered to be latent pro-Russians, but because of the war in Ukraine, they are not eager to declare that they are sympathizing with Russia. So this is one important issue. So for the elections, I think that I mean, Russia is trying to streamline its support in Ukraine, and they are trying now to go with one candidate, for instance, for the presidential elections. We'll see whether they will manage, but I saw just today news that one of the, let's say, Russian supporters, Vadim Rabinovich, he said he will not candidate, not run, and that means that he'll support the Oppo bloc, the opposition bloc, candidate boycott. So it means that they are trying to group and to go for election. Although at this moment, I don't know whether my opinion might change in a few months, but at this moment, I don't think Russians can get the presidency in Ukraine. However, I think this will be a good exercise for the parliamentary elections, which are the most important from my perspective, because if Russians manage to get about 1/3 of the mandates of the next parliament, and this is the projections as of now, then it will mean that Russia will have a serious force in the Ukrainian parliament. Well, not a force which will allow them, of course, to form the government, but a force which will allow them to block certain initiatives and to create a lot of noise regarding certain actions which might be directed at strengthening the independence of Ukraine. In terms of real military threats, I mean, I would like to underline that the escalation in the east will likely take place and will be until at least the elections in Ukraine. We see new areas of escalations in such locations like the Azov Sea. Yeah, this is quite recent. And we see also the fact that Ukraine is trying to safeguard itself from let's say, cooperation, if we can call it like this, with Russia in many areas. For the last, since 2014, by the way, Ukraine and Russia, Ukraine denounced 44 agreements with Russia. This is a very big number. And the key agreement on friendship, cooperation, and the basic agreement was not prolonged by Ukraine, so Ukraine did not denounce it, but did not prolong it also, which shows very clear the stance which Ukraine took in this regard. Also, one thing to mention is the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, where a lot of diplomacy takes place. For instance, for the last 2 parliamentary seasons in the Council of Europe, Russia tried to return into the Council of Europe by changing the regulations of the Council of Europe, which would make basically Council of Europe unable to impose new sanctions on Russia, or not new sanctions, but to impose, basically to demand from Russia certain actions, which would how to say, reinforce the position of Ukraine and would call actually Russia for a decent behavior, let me put it like this, in regard to the independence and sovereignty of our countries. Russia failed to do this twice. It failed to do this in January 2018, and it failed to do this quite recently in October. But this threat this risk is still there, and I think we are about to witness this for the next Parliamentary Assembly. One moment about the Ukrainian army, because some of you might certainly know that Ukrainian army changed a lot in the last 4 years. I'll give you just a few numbers. The budget allocated for defense and security in Ukraine is equal to 5.26% in 2018, which is about $6 billion. Well, of course, this might seem not a very big sum, maybe for some NATO countries, yeah. But for Ukraine, I think this is a real achievement, and I think Ukraine has done an enormous, tremendous effort in reinventing itself in terms of security and defense, having especially this great experience on how to counter hybrid war and conventional war, because what happens in the east of Ukraine is no longer hybrid. I mean, it has some elements, but it's already conventional war in the east of Ukraine. Now, maybe a few words on EU, if I still have time. I do, I think, yeah. A few words on the EU. Well, EU has a very wide and complex relations with Ukraine, and actually, I think what Ukraine achieved in the last 4 years, it did not achieve for the last 23 years. Association agreement, visa-free cooperation in many areas. I won't have time to mention all of them. I just mentioned that in terms, for instance, good news are coming from trade. 40.5% of Ukrainian exports are going to the EU, and about 9.1 to Russia. Well, country-wise, Russia is still the biggest trade partner of Ukraine, but this is going to change because by the end of the year, it's very likely that Poland will become the trade partner #1 for Ukraine. So it's going to overtake from Russia the #1 trade partner, and I think this is also a very significant, because I mean, a few years ago one could not imagine this taking place. I mean, so economic-wise, Ukraine is also less dependent on Russia, and I think this is also something which allows Ukraine to be more robust and resilient when it comes to threats, economic threats, which are coming from the side of Russia. Finally, I cannot overlook the subject which was mentioned during the first panel about corruption. I think it was Victoria who raised this. Indeed, there is an issue in Ukraine with this. However, I would say, I mean, I'm half positive, half not positive, half optimist, half pessimist on this, because Ukraine did a very good job in setting up the anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine. So we have now the entire chain of anti-corruption agencies, and the last one, which is established these days, right now, is the High Anti-Corruption Court, which should become operational, I mean, in a few months' time, and we'll see then if these institutions are able to deliver clear-cut results, because you know, people, when the revolution of dignity took place, they had two main demands. One was fight against corruption, and second was dual oligarchization. I mean, none of this really happened, I mean, but there is a process associated with both of this, but mainly with anti-corruption, not with dual oligarchization, mainly with anti-corruption. And I think Ukraine has shown quite a lot of progress in this, although I have to say not without the support, and not support, but sometimes without EU pushing very much and conditioning a lot of support upon the implementation of concrete and adoption of concrete legislation regarding the anti-corruption. So I think this is a source of weakness for Ukraine, but I still think that the Russian threat is the biggest weakness. I still think like this. And EU can do a lot actually in Ukraine, and now I'm slowly passing to recommendations. EU can do a lot of things in Ukraine. EU in Ukraine is seen as a global player, indeed, I mean. And not only a global player, you know, there is a joke that is a global player as well, and we hope it won't be a global prayer. So basically, EU does a lot, and I have few recommendations for the Eastern Partnership countries and few recommendations for the EU. I think that this relation which was created between Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova is something it should have been done for a long time, and I see this taking shape. There is a cooperation at the parliamentary level now. I think that it would be good to have a cooperation at the level of the ministries in charge of the occupied territories, in charge of their integration. I think this is important. Also, I think Ukraine could share a lot of experience when it comes to hybrid threats, when it comes to war with Russia, because it has an experience which is every day new and more valuable, basically. So I think this is quite important to happen. Ukraine already started to do this slowly, but I think Georgia and Moldova are precisely, maybe Moldova even more, precisely the countries which need to learn more from this. And from the side of these three countries, at least these three countries, but maybe here Armenia and other countries from Eastern Partnership can join us, is to offer a vision of the to offer a vision of how the new European Commission, the new European Parliament could join efforts basically with these countries, because currently there is no such vision. I mean, everyone is in election mood. We don't know how this will evolve after the new iteration of the European bodies. EU bodies. Last recommendation for the EU, I think the PESC, for the Permanent Structured Cooperation, which was recently created, is a good also maybe institution to cooperate with, because they have some of the, let's say, some of the instruments which are available only for member states, but there are some other instruments like, for instance, military training and exercises, joint capabilities on land, air, and sea, cyber space, and so on. So basically, these capabilities could be available potentially also for these countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. And I think this is something we need to put on the agenda for the next revision of the Eastern Partnership, basically, if this is to come.
Okay, thank you very much, Leonid, for encapsulating some of the points that you wanted to raise. I think just to kind of make a resume of it from my side, I think you touched upon certain issues that we can group in certain categories. I think that one category is the overview of the security environment, the way you kind of saw it and the way you see it, you know, with the major actors who either contribute to your security or actually are the challenge to your security. There, I would like you to later on, if you have time, to reflect on the issue with Russia, which you already did, but also some other tensions or frictions with a neighboring country and how it affects the Ukrainian role in a larger kind of the community. No, afterwards. Just kind of frame it. Exactly, to frame it. So I think that's going to be more complete. Also, the point to make is that apart from the Ukraine challenge, I mean, big challenge on the security field, I think there are two parallel processes which are taking place in Ukraine, which is the state building, which is a very important part of this institutional transformation that you have been talking about. So not easy. And as you said, it's a mixed bag with the positives and with the negatives. So definitely that's something that will definitely come up as a challenge, I think, in the medium to long term, and that has to be responded upon, but also a nation building. And I think that the threat perception asymmetry that you have been talking about in different regions of Ukraine is a very interesting reflection of that, because the threat, which is for some a survival, basically a kind of the threat of the statehood, to the statehood and to the Ukrainian elite is not perceived the same way, depending on many things, but I think it's kind of a reflection of the state building, which is taking place at different speeds. So you have that dynamic. With that, I would like to pass the word to Batu Kotelia to let us kind of give a Georgian perspective on all of this. I mean, from your perspective, what might be the lessons learned for Ukraine, and also the reflections on what has been said. You know, it's very ad hoc, I know, but still, from your perspective, I think it's going to be a valuable contribution.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank organizers. It's a very interesting and also important discussion that will in the future help us to calibrate different approaches, not only from the civil society or think tank community, but I guess for the government perspective as well. So, and when we speak, and we usually see this title that there is a new security environment. Frankly speaking, there is nothing new under the sun. There might be some changes, but conceptually the environment is, and the methods as well as the aims and the goals are always the similar, especially for those who've been part of the wrong side of the history during the Soviet occupation. Therefore, the similarity of the context in a larger degree between Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova is striking. Of course, there are the national peculiarities that we add on to these processes, but still, the most important component that we see from Georgian perspective as well, there are the several key targets that Russia is trying to achieve in that part of the world, which could be structured in the following components. First is a disruption of all possible positive dynamics, whether it's an integration process, whether it's a nation building process, or reaching national consensus on some key issues. or finding the common ground for the social cohesion. All these components need to be disrupted from their perspective. Second, the best way to achieve the disruption is to polarize the society. And for that purposes, we see again these similarities, and this polarization is happening on a grand scale and then on the micro level as well, different field by field, region by region, etc. And eventually, these two components is leading to the paralyzed political process, totally absence of the political process, or at least squeezing the space to the minimal level that will never have a chance to come back or to affect the proper process of the statecraft. And this is achieved, first of all, by eliminating the transparency on the old processes, finding the allies within the country, and one of the, let's say, best ally for that strategy is the corruption. So intransparent funding or illegal funding of the political processes, particularly the electoral process, is also the key to discredit the perception of democracy as a future, let's say, common way of building the state. And of course, this is accompanied by propaganda tools, not necessarily only pro-Russian, but just trying to fuel all these small problems or the bigger problems that every society has. I strongly believe that the Eastern Partnership is a visionary process, and it needs to stay as a visionary process. Well, the problem is that if this process will be transformed to a more technical bureaucratic process, then it will be hard to see any success out of it. And we quite often see that the great ideas, the visionary political ideas, being led by the bureaucracy. Bureaucracy needs to implement this, but not to lead the political process. And that's also the common problem that we see in our region. I will touch upon this issue later on as well. So, and I mentioned propaganda, which quite successfully is trying to seek the irrational fear of different type of fears in the societies, and this fear is quite sophisticatedly constructed. And one of the biggest, and there are a number of them, but I would like to pick one very important component. This is a fear of doing things by ourselves. So this apathy is really strongly supported by the propaganda machine. Living in the Soviet system, we all remember that the major line was that, yeah, you are just a small part of the system, you cannot change anything, there is some big guys up there, and you just have to follow. So this apathy is coming back. Of course, there are reasons of the several waves of the failures of establishing independent state, but that's not the reason to give up. But the propaganda is really trying to do it successfully. First of all, and then besides fear, it undermines this national consensus, as I said, and our key target is, again, the institutions. Weak institutions, of course, prevents any further effective formulation of understanding these threats and then respond to those threats. Institutions, whether it be state, political institutions, civil society, you name it. So that leads, and it's also the commonality of what we see in these Eastern Partnership countries is, and quite often been mentioned, and I'm really happy that this issue has been mentioned more and more openly. This is an attempted state capture. In some cases, it's more effective, in some cases, maybe less effective, but still, it's an ongoing process. And unfortunately, we are in a more reactive mode rather than proactive mode. I just would like to read a brief description of the state capture, its classical determination. Of course, there are a number of variations in this. So state capture occurs when the ruling elite or the powerful businessmen manipulate policy formulation and influences the emerging rule of the game, including laws and economic regulations, to their advantage, who extracts the substantial private gains and benefits its own fortune by absence of the clear rule of the law. And as far as the politicians are concerned, fear of social instability, which follows a period of the bad governance or the risk of the losing next elections, could potentially have an influence on mitigating vested interest within the state institutions. And when and it's very important to keep in mind that the state institutions is the primary target, and there has been primary target, as we see in all our countries. And in this regard, of course, one of the key components was the integration process that Georgia passed through, and the success story is the integration process with the NATO. But while the eventual outcome is very important, the process itself helped us a lot to build strong institutions that was hard and still is hard to destroy by the ruling elite who is attempting the state capture. So the part of the resilience is a strong institutions, and this integration process really was very important. Also the EU integration process, the visa-free DCFTA, were practical deliverables that led us to strengthen the institutions. And it's not impossible, but hard to retract back. But of course, we see the similar problems now, Georgia sliding back in a quite a wrong direction, particularly in a broader context of state capture that is happening in Georgia. So, and just to finalize what I was just said, with this kind of environment, of course, we see also in parallel through the propaganda or financing method supported the other components, not necessarily pro-Russian sentiments, but more extreme feelings, whether it would be linked to some populistic, nationalistic ideas that also is connected to this global trend of this identity crisis or mistrust of the democratic way of governance. To sum up what needs to be done from the foreign perspective, from the European perspective, I think the process needs to be shifted from the reactive mode to the more proactive mode, and instead of letting bureaucracy to lead the process, there needs to be a political leadership, and then this political vision implemented by bureaucracy. For this, we need a strategy, strategic interest, and also strategic interest exercised then in practical deliverables. The more job needs to be done on the domestic level. It's first of all, I think, is an overall institutional reform, but particularly security sector reform. Because what we witnessed in Georgia is that the areas in the security sector and institutions that we did not manage to reform properly is now hurting back and actually lets the state capture to be exercised more effectively. And the second is like a universal rule, follow the money. Because all this is happening because of a lot of illegal streams of the money. And this illegal money, of course, is generating the process of the state capture through different levels, and it will be harder and harder to revert it back. So again, to finalize this, when we speak about Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, from the European perspective, as well as from our national perspective, I think we have to approach this issue that Georgia is, and Georgia's success is more than Georgia. Ukraine's success is more than only Ukraine's success. Moldova's success is more than Moldova's success, and all of our countries. So, in terms of the reaction or being a reactive, I think it's nothing wrong to be offensive. So it's really time to put our key values, freedom and security, freedom and democracy, to put on the offense. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving that opinion about what are some of the important lessons to be taken into account. With that, I would like to ask Mr. Nizhnikov to give us his assessment and his thinking, which is coming from the north a bit, from Finland, and the way they view it, because the security challenge, which is what we are witnessing right now in Ukraine, has repercussions for many. And definitely that is something that has changed them quite a lot of opinions in many of the capitals. And I'm pretty sure that there's a lot that people are observing on that part. So the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Arti.
All right. Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me say that I really enjoyed the paper. It's very complex. Actually, it's short, but in a very short space. It presents in a very coherent way a very complex situation. The key challenges that Ukraine faces, and actually what has been happening in the last 4 years. So that's a job well done, and I recommend to read it afterwards. Regarding the Finnish perspective, I'm not from Finland. I live there, but you know, it's I just learned that something big happened in Helsinki last week, and I was like, what? You know, what happened? It's, well, I read the news, but not Finnish. One thing I would say, and this is I'm from Belarus originally, is that definitely. Well, let's not use Belarus as examples. They will mislead us. But one thing which we have, because you're right when you talk about, especially when you talk about security, environment, and different threats, that Finland is also on the borderline. Well, there's Russia, and there are a lot of hybrid threats that are coming, and which Finnish government has to deal with. And I would make a very, let's say, broad, but still try to link it to Ukraine. And this will answer what actually can bring this actual security to the country, and it's about institutions. And I'm not talking about strong institutions in general, because strong institutions in hands of right people can bring absolutely different results than we expect. But it's a complete transformation to what different researchers call inclusive or open access institutions. It's a long goal. And this is what brings us to Ukraine in 2014, is that actually, if we look at Euromaidan revolution, and especially the Russia's later war against Ukraine, is that actually and especially societal demands and attitudes, how basically society reacted to what has been happening in general. Actually, we had this window of opportunity to actually at least make this breakthrough and try to build qualitatively new set of institutions in Ukraine. The question is whether Ukraine succeeded or failed, and of course the jury is still there. I can say that from my perspective, we see a clear situation that since 2016, the new winners, and we call them, and these are the parts of the old elites, they basically very much frozen the developments, stabilized, and very happy to defend the status quo, which favors them. Which means that still we have the old, very interesting fusion of old, kind of a Soviet plus wild 90s set of political and economic structures, which basically would be the main gate to Russians to influence Ukraine and control the situation. Saying that, because I know there is very little time, I would basically ask a rhetoric question: if Russia is satisfied with what's going on in Ukraine now, or not? And the answer from Moscow would be yes. And this is a very probably bad answer for us, especially when we try to talk about how much has been achieved through the shift in Ukraine. So saying that, we actually wrote a paper with my colleague Arkady Moshes on Russia-Ukraine relations. And here I will just not talk much about it. And one of the main starting points was exactly the case that in 2014, Russia, which always has been the main obstacle to change, we didn't see much demand from within, but at least it was there. It was the major obstacle, and basically has a veto status in the country. Its four pillars of influence on Ukraine, all of them eroded. We talk about military threats. This is true. I would argue that actually the security dimension, to a much extent, is outsourced to the West. So it's West-Russia dialogue and Ukraine security, then Russia-Ukraine dialogue. So we basically had a chance. There was an option. So there was a clear drop in economic, including energy, societal, people to people, and soft power, as well as political, about elites and coalition he's going to run away. The problem is that since 2016, we see that the old opaque schemes which Russia used before, especially in energy, to influence and control in a way, indirectly Ukrainian elites, they're back, which involve the current president, they involve Mr. Medvedchuk, that Leonid actually describes this in his paper. And this is the major trouble. And this influences what Leonid started with, societal trends, why people are neutral. They don't, in 2014, we saw that amazing number, more than probably around 70% were ready to persevere all the hardship for the sake of reforms in Ukraine. Now they're saying, come on, guys, we see what's happening. In the polls, everybody has anti-rating in a way, if we compare the presidential polls. They don't trust, they want a new country, that's why, as Batu noted, state building and nation building started, society-driven mostly. Now they're basically going back to what? Nothing changed. Back to basics, and this gives an absolutely, this is what we are talking about, not presidential or parliamentary elections. This was going to be what we, in a way, have seen in Moldova, that the pro-Russian forces would actually have a very good opportunity to actually have quite a good results. And since Ukraine is parliamentary presidential republic, that would really be, that would tell us that in a way, Russia, without doing much in the last 2 years, have been able to achieve what, in a way, benefits it most for its interest in the country. I will probably have to stop this, because one lesson from Belarus and Finland is that order is before all. So 5 minutes, which you probably spoken more than that.
Thank you. I mean, it would have been very difficult to misinterpret your family. Definitely know that you are from Belarus, but giving your staying in Finland, you know, it would give kind of a more of a northern perspective. That was actually the gist of what I was saying. Now I would like to move to the Chisinau and then see how the view from Moldova might be of the what is happening in Ukraine, and how do you filter it through your own lens, and what are some of the things that you think are important for Moldova as such, the way the scenario is going to be evolving in the context of Ukraine. So I would like to ask Rosyan to give us his opinion on that.
Thank you, Irakli. First of all, thank you, Angela, for this opportunity to participate in the forum. And in my presentation, I refer to 2 points or 2 positions about the hybrid peace and hybrid aggression in case of Moldova, and parallel to not only Ukraine but in Georgia. In 2016, Federica Mogherini presented a report of hybrid peace to human security. In this report, focused on 2 regions, Horn of Africa and the Balkans, and 4 continents, including Ukraine. In case of Ukraine, conclusion of this report, using different terms, Ukraine have a systemic corruption, another problem in the country. Report not present information about Moldova, but some of conclusion of this report is actually from a country. Actually not for Moldova, but I discussed with my Georgian colleagues at the same time for Georgia. In my point of view, Moldova, or in my country, we have a hybrid government. This year, European Parliament adopted 2 resolutions. Last resolution adopted yesterday. And the European Parliament recognized captured states, problem with the rule of law, human rights, limited media pluralism, etc. And all of this problem reflected in the part of the situation in the same time in Georgia and in Ukraine. About the hybrid aggression, Moldova targeted this aggression after 1991, 1992, but national authority did not recognize it. Only in 2017, Constitutional Court adopted a decision and recognized the part of the territory is occupied and has occupation troops of the Russian Federation. After this decision, we expect the government and parliament adopted a different law, normative acts. but it was not meant to be. At the same time, in this year, United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution regarding the complete and unconditional withdrawal of foreign military troops from the territory of the Republic of Moldova. In this case, Moldovan authorities did not insist they were Russian occupation troops. In his presentation, Vika say about internal and external aggression. The presence in my country, and especially I offer very short information about the inside problem or inside aggression in case of Transnistria. The aggression is supported by the proxy from the inside by supporting the separatist regime in the Transnistrian region, purchasing the electricity from the Kuchurka. We have in Transnistria manufacturing part of military industrial complex of the Russian Federation. Occupation troops in the Transnistrian region organized military exercise. In 2016, 48. In 2017, 150. And in this year, in period of January, October, 250 military exercise. You will wonder what was the reaction of the Moldovan authorities. The answer is simple. Only press release where is expressed concern of this exercise. In the 27 years after independence, but especially in the last 4 years, under auspicion of operative groups of Russian Federation, peacekeeping mission, and paramilitary troops of separatist regime, Russian Federation has ensured the interoperability of these troops in different dimensions: general staff command, communication, logistic, etc. Peacekeeping mission in my country is an umbrella of develop this influence of Russian Federation in my country. Very short about the policy of reintegration and the occupation. In case of Ukraine and Georgia, it's clear. Georgia recognized Russia its occupant and have occupation troops on the territory. In Georgia and Ukraine, we have law, normative acts of reintegration process. In Moldova, we have a policy of small steps of reintegration. And this policy of I don't know, part of sovereignty for the Transnistrian region. And the umbrella of this policy resolve a problem of the citizens from the left bank and right bank of the Dniester. Finally, Leonid, Dumitru, and Irakli, we have a very good presentation, and this presentation offer good examples of understanding of the process in our country. And we need together create and develop different mechanisms to combat the different hybrid threats in field of security and not the military. About the communication, cyber, about we need to discuss about security of different space and so. And in future, maybe we need to develop a different target platform in this field.
Thank you very much. With that, I would like to ask Ms. Rachova to give us, sorry if I'm not pronouncing the last name the right way, to give us the view from Visegrad and how I know that you have some very interesting polls and results that you want to share with us, and the way the security of Ukraine and actually the understanding of the Ukrainian problem is seen from where you come, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to the organizers. Very good, very interesting event. And also thank you for the paper. It is a very detailed, very interesting summary on a very challenging topic. Indeed, I would just like to comment on a few things, if you don't mind. First, you mentioned the sanctions when it comes to targeted sanctions, when it comes to Nord Stream 2. And I believe when talking about the EU's reaction and the reactions on the Ukrainian crisis, we need to evaluate the sanctions that have been used by the EU and the US. To what extent have they been effective? I myself have been critical when it comes to the sanctions and their effectiveness, but I think we have to admit that some targeted sanctions work. Actually, especially when it comes to targeted economic sanctions, they can have a huge impact on certain sectors of the industry. For instance, when it comes to banning import of certain technologies that the industry is dependent on. And the second one is diplomatic sanctions targeted against individuals. And actually, in 2018, there were a set of US sanctions which had effect on one of the biggest aluminium producer, a Russian company, which shares were down by 50%. And the whole Russian market was down by 10% as a result, which I believe we can say that's an impact. So I think sanctions should still be considered as a tool against Russian aggression. When it comes to, you talked about civil society in the eastern part of Ukraine, but in your paper you also mentioned that civil society is actually quite critical, self-critical, I believe. You said, and the population, so that maybe they know better what to expect from the EU and what to expect from their own officials. And on this note, I believe that talking about the strengths of civil society when it comes to bringing a democratic change or any sort of positive change is crucial. And I believe that without an active and strong civil society, bringing democratic change is very, very difficult. So I think that when it comes to work done within Ukraine, as well as Ukraine's cooperation with other countries such as the EU or Central Eastern Europe, we should also focus on how to strengthen the civil society. Should that be, support for NGOs or other ways to unite and activate people? But I think it should be on the agenda, in my opinion. And when it comes to, I will be very quick, when it comes to hybrid threats, and especially disinformation, fake news, propaganda, which is a topic that's high on both the EU's and NATO's agenda, and it's a new challenge that is constantly changing based on how the social media evolves. I believe Ukraine has experience on countering this type of threat that we could all learn from and work together on fighting these sort of challenges. So I believe that this could be one area to learn from Ukraine and also cooperate. Because when it comes to propaganda, the EU, and fake news, the EU is not really an exception. And I just would like to share some some numbers with you, which quite surprised me. Some of them when it comes to the perception of Russia in Central Eastern Europe. Thank you. So my colleagues were doing opinion polls in the Visegrad countries, and when they asked, the conflict in Ukraine persists because of presence of Russian forces in Ukraine. When it comes to Poland, 61% agreed. That's the highest number. But when it comes to, for instance, Slovakia and Hungary, 50% agreed. 59 when it comes to the Czech Republic. So I leave this to you, how to interpret these numbers, of course. And one more, I believe, interesting question. When it comes to, did Russia influence the outcome of the US presidential elections, which received a lot of media attention in Western countries? When it comes to the respondents of Central Eastern European countries, those who agree that Russia influenced US presidential elections, in Hungary was 32%. In Slovakia, also 32%. In Poland, 42%, and Czech Republic, 43%. Yes, so I believe these numbers might be higher. Of course, I don't have polls on that. Might be higher when it comes to the US or other Western countries, but I believe these are certainly interesting numbers. So I would like to finish with that and give the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your observations. Now I would like to turn to Stanislav, and the last but not the least, of course, and I'm pretty sure that from your travel and very long observation of what is happening in the EAP countries, you can draw the right conclusions and kind of give us your opinion of the security environment and the way you see how the Ukrainian elites and the government is actually coping with that. And in the future, where do you see that those problems going, and what might be some of the scenarios that you see?
Thank you. I would like to express my gratitude to organizers for giving me for a second time in a row chance to address this distinguished forum. Maybe you posed some important questions, and keywords would be how Ukraine tackles current security problems and how about the future. I think they tackle security problems pretty well, given the domestic environment which we observed in 2014. Nevertheless, I don't think it's kind of for us a way to have a laid-back approach and to congratulate us for such big achievements. Well, actually, I see future threats for Ukraine is actually in the cyberspace. And I haven't read Leo's paper, so I'm guilty. But at least I would like to pick on what he mentioned, cyber capabilities, and to give at least bad news for Ukraine, good news for Ukraine, and some recommendations on cyber. Yes. Since we are think tankers, we are supposed to think about future. And yeah, it's also an occasion for me to promote our recent publication on Russian cyber strategies, which has a very nice chapter on Georgia and Ukraine. And I would like to recommend to read this one. And as well, we are on the Romanian soil, and Romania is the lead nation on the NATO-Ukraine Trust Fund on cyber defense. And we have to recognize the Romanian contribution also to the security in such critical domain for Ukraine. But then another reason to talk about cybersecurity is because Ukraine is the top 30 countries in the world, mostly exposed to cyber intrusions. Ukraine is in the top 5 countries most targeted by cyber espionage. And Ukraine is probably by far is the most targeted nation in Eastern neighborhood by malicious cyber activities. So it's current, but also present. It's only future threat. And here I'm coming with the bad news from my Ukrainian friends. Why I think cyber threat will increase and not will decrease for Ukraine is that, for first reason is that Russian other tools are losing the effect. Leo alluded to economic decreasing levers. He also mentioned reforms in the military. So if Russia would like to change the status quo, at least it has to invest much more military resources. And then it's not easy to conduct intelligence activities on the ground in Ukraine when it was like 5 years ago. And then cyber, it's a kind of partially solution. It's cheap, it's quick, it's efficient. Nobody dies, at least on the Russian side. And the effect probably might be much bigger. The second reason is digitalization of Ukrainian society. All the reforms Ukraine is conducting and gonna conduct mean that you gave on the paper work, you eliminate it, and you move everything in the digital space. And I will give you one example. It's not only about public administration, but medical reform. There is a project to create the healthcare database where will be stored some of the information. At the initial stage, it will be something very basic, but I assume that in years, in 5 years, there will be much more digital stored information about medical record, illnesses, drugs used by patients. And it makes a very attractive target for hostile powers. So those two reasons make me to think that Russia will rely more on cyber than it's doing now. But then there are also some good news for Ukraine. And the good news is that Ukraine has a very powerful, boosting, and lively IT sector, around 3,000 companies and 1,000 startups. There are more than 100,000 IT experts, and it's projected there will be more than 200,000 by 2025. Ukraine is not only increasing its military capacities, but also cyber capacities. Not few countries in this world can claim that they conducted cyber defensive operations against Russia, and Ukraine seemingly conducted such kind of operations. So you need to have know-how and to know how to do it. And then we think that in cyber, Ukraine was very successful in tackling digital propaganda. At least media literacy program is a success, which should be extended, but we already have some initial results in this sphere. Well, with all this positive news, I think Ukraine still needs to do more, and here I will give some recommendations if Leo would like to include in his paper. But basically, what we have is that the number of cyber infiltrations are still discovered too late in Ukraine, sometimes 3, 8, 9 months, which allows to cyber hostile powers to plan bugs, to do reconnaissance, and to prepare future attack. Ukraine probably needs also to assess much better vulnerabilities of its networks and to conduct it regularly, not only once in a while. And here, external donors can help, but the problem is some restrictive norms in the Ukrainian legislation. If Ukrainian friends are able to amend legislation, probably more external aid can come to help to assess the vulnerabilities of IT networks. Then, obviously, for Ukraine is a problem to staff cybersecurity units and to retain the personnel, because almost all these nice IT experts in Ukraine, they work in the private sector, because salaries are more attractive than the public domain. And here I would also suggest maybe to copy the scheme implemented by BERT to support reforms unit in each ministry or in a couple of ministries in Ukraine. BERT and EBRD, it's Romanian, sorry, EBRD. And maybe we can also to have this kind of financial support to retain cyber security experts in the public institutions in Ukraine. And another one is maybe EUAM can hire and plant more cybersecurity experts to sustain civilian sector reform in Ukraine, the Ministry of Interior and other relevant bodies. Then Ukraine has a very rich experience in recovering after massive cyber attacks. No one almost has it in Eastern Partnership countries. Maybe Ukraine can be the leader or propose a kind of multilateral or trilateral platform to share experience, to explain how they did, and to teach others how to recover from a massive potential cyber attack in the future. I would also imagine kind of cyber exercises between Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, and whoever wants to join the board. And cyber exercises is not theory and it's not a joke. It's really necessary to develop procedures and capacities for bodies, how they should react in case of attack on critical infrastructure. And I would expect also from Ukrainian side a contribution to this updated vision of Eastern Partnership after 2020 with some proposals how to extend cyber dimension or digital dimension of Eastern Partnership. Because all societies in the Eastern neighborhood are moving towards digital economies, people rely more on e-solutions, so it means that the surface for cyber attack is increasing. The infrastructure which Eastern Partnership countries will have to protect is expanding. So instead of maybe focusing too much on the hard and military security threats, which is important, let's think also about future security threats. This I will conclude my intervention. I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your observations and recommendations. Now I would like to turn to the audience. If you have questions, please do put them. And then I would like to ask Leo to respond to the questions, but also to reflect on some of the comments, because we're running out of time, so I wanted to kind of bring this together.
I would like quickly to put one issue on the table and maybe ask the reflections of all the panelists. So I sensed listening to your interventions that there is this opinion, discarding the foreign exploitation of some internal vulnerabilities. And basically one way that it was put, it was like, it's not foreign interference, it is a domestic vulnerability. It is the internal political forces, the oligarchs, the corrupt governments that create the vulnerabilities. And so, you know, it has nothing to do with foreign. Now, if you accept that those are tools, abstract there, right? It's just potential tools to exploit. Anybody can exploit them. Internal forces can exploit them, external forces can exploit them. And if you accept this idea, you know, having a view on potential exploitation of by Russia of those internal vulnerabilities that we talked, how would you review the opinion that you presented earlier I don't want to confuse you, but I think the thing that triggered this question was the statement of one of the panelists that it's about the strength of domestic institutions. And if you look at Western countries with strong domestic institutions like US, UK, and so on, that they were still exposed to foreign intervention. And so that would suggest, as an internal validity, would suggest that strong domestic institutions are not a guarantee for foreign aggression. So with those things in mind, would you review your opinion that it is more important to look at internal threats rather than external threats when we think about Eastern Europe?
Is there any other question, please?
And hybrid threats were mentioned several times during the panel. So my question is whether the efforts against or combating this cyber hybrid threats and specifically propaganda are in the countries, especially Ukraine, because I know there were a lot of such efforts, and I would be interested to hear how Leonid assesses these efforts, whether they were successful.
One more question, please, and then we can move to the
I have
answering.
several questions, if I may. The first goes to Leo. You mentioned about this big group of population which you called neutralists to some extent. But those who are not for European Union and not for Eurasian Union, but yeah. So basically just taking on the terminology or maybe the approach which was proposed by our German colleague, that apathy could be just triggered from within. Could you just put it, what do you think? Maybe part of this group is like victims of Russian interference to some extent. So basically they influence it to some extent to be neutral. And basically it's not about it's not about domestic policy, it's about some malign interference. And the second question goes to our Georgian colleague. Could you elaborate a little bit more about a high-level dialogue on security you have with European Union? Do you consider it effective? And could it be like an example for Ukraine to elevate the level of cooperation on security agenda to this kind of cooperation format, high-level security dialogue? I could subscribe on the issues Stanislav mentioned about cybersecurity, and basically, yes, it's quite an issue for Ukraine, and basically that's why we wanted to create a center for cybersecurity in Eastern Partnership region, and we still want to launch this idea. And the question to the lady from GovSec, I would like to, I wonder, what do you think, is Central Europe a bulwark for sanctions within the European Union, or is it a kind of threat, just against the backdrop that, for example, Foreign Minister Sijarto openly asked for reconsideration of policy of sanctions?
Thank you very much. I think we have enough questions, and now I would like to ask Leo to reflect on some of the comments that he wants to, but also to answer the questions, and then we will ask panelists to do the same, and then we can wrap it up, because I think that we are reaching the end of our session.
I hope I can have enough time to cover all the comments, at least
consolidate some of the answers.
Consolidate, okay, optimization, yeah. So first of all, on Dumitro's question about domestic institutions and whether if these institutions are strong, then we shouldn't expect, could we expect interference or not? My opinion is that the strong institution does not guarantee, it's not, I would say, a shield against interference, against foreign interference. I think that indeed corruption might weaken more. I mean, you know, in Ukrainian government, we had the interpreter of the prime minister who was basically leaking all the information to Russians. Yeah, this case is indeed telling, but yeah, the institutions, they were not, I mean, the integrity standards were not there. But I think that it's not only related with the, because today we spoke also from the, too much from the perspective of corruption, but I think it's also from the perspective, it should be seen from the perspective of the professional service. I mean, in Ukraine, I think we have a problem related to corruption, but there is also, but maybe it's not the biggest one, there's a problem of professional service. I don't think if you would have in state institutions professionals who know their job very well and who know what they have to do, when they have to do different things, then the, how to say, Ukraine would be much more able to withstand any assault from external forces. So I think this is, so I hope I answered your question from my perspective. Now with the question of Boris, I have to say that I'm not too much into this. I mean, professional. I can give you my own opinion about how to say, countering hybrid threats, especially in terms of propaganda and in terms of disinformation. I think Ukraine had many levels of pushing back. I mean, we have the very good example in civil society with Stop Fake. I'm sure you're familiar with this, where they try to identify fake news, disinformation, and to expose this. Of course, this is not massive because, you know, ordinary people don't read Stop Fake. For this, back in 2014, I think, Ukraine banned a lot of Russian channels. The problem is that we have inside Ukraine people who continue disinformation, and they do this, well, at the direct request of Russia or not, but this is still taking place. However, I think Ukraine is still much more immune to the disinformation from the Russian side and fake news. So this is my problem. My explanation. The problem is that the media, as you know, there is a pluralist media in Ukraine. However, most of the media outlets, influential media outlets, belong to certain oligarchs. And we have a democracy without Democrats in this regard because, you know, there is a wide range of views presented. However, this system is not sustainable in a way because at some point someone pays for this. You have the term jinsa, yeah, in Ukraine, which means news, paid news in a hidden manner. So it's not, it doesn't go as advertising. So on the question of Gennady about neutralist, is it like external inspired neutralist or not? My impression was that we talked to people of Kharkiv, Odessa, Kherson, Uzhgorod. So you know, it's I have enough like information to form my opinion. I had the impression that these people are not necessarily foreign-inspired neutralists. Many of them, as they confessed, they become neutralists because they think that with the current approach, we won't be able to solve the conflict in Ukraine, in the east of Ukraine. And therefore, they think if we will become neutral, this will facilitate, in a way, the settlement in the east of Ukraine, which I personally disagree with this opinion. However, this explanation seems logical from their side, from their point of view. So I answered the question now very briefly on few comments. I calibrated them already. Thank you for your provocative question about is Russia satisfied? I think to answer very shortly, Russia cannot win anymore in Ukraine as it is of now. We'll see after elections, but Ukraine may still lose. This is the format which is currently describes the situation in the case of Ukraine. Now with the sanctions, I think, and thank you for my colleague from Globsec for raising this issue because I have it in my paper. I mean, EU approach in Ukraine was, in short, how to say, formalized in 3 pillars. Attempts to diplomatically resolve the conflict, like Normandy format and all the types of negotiations, sanctions against Russia, and support for Ukraine to withstand the Russian assault, basically. And we see on all of these 3 pillars, there is sort of weakening of the positions because Italy is asking for discussions before the prolongation of the sanctions in December this year. I couldn't say this is under threat. There might be a situation when for Ukraine, it will be much more difficult to explain why we need the prolongation of sanctions and precisely of the sanctions you mentioned, the economic sanctions, because these are the ones which matter. For the last comment about the UA proposed vision for development of Eastern Partnership, Stas mentioned about this. We had an attempt from the side of Ukraine. President Poroshenko at the last Eastern Partnership Summit in Brussels proposed the 4 unions. Energy union with the EU, digital union, union with Schengen, and remind me, customs union. Well, this proposal is not widely shared in some Ukrainian circles of experts. and professionals, especially when it comes to customs union, because we think this might be not beneficial for Ukraine. It might be beneficial at the beginning, but overall, like to give you an example, if US and EU introduce various barriers, trade barriers for each other, Ukraine might become a collateral victim in this if it has a customs union with the EU. So, and association with Schengen or union with Schengen, I think it's unreal because we know, I mean, Romania has been on this path for a long time, and still since 2011, since the first recommendation to join Schengen, it still didn't happen. For the rest, two unions, energy union, it's EU who doesn't want to, because then EU will have to provide not only, how to say, Ukraine takes responsibilities, but it wants guarantees from the side of EU, which EU doesn't want to do with Ukraine. So Ukraine is somehow angry on this, and I think it has reasons to be so. And on the second, on digital union, I think you exploited this issue from a very different perspective when it's seen in Ukraine. We see digital union as, you know, no roaming tariffs for telecommunications, while you put it from the perspective of cyber and different services. I think this is the one we should also see it. And I think this is, we are very much in favor of this. So I hope I managed very shortly.
Thank you very much. I guess if the panelists want to respond to some of the questions, and then we can wrap it up.
Just very briefly on the hybrid war. Well, the concept of the hybrid war is that it should be warned before even the target realizes that it's in the war. So that's why all this preparatory work to reach the final outcome of having this new democracies, the failed projects. That's a final outcome, but a lot of preparation has been done in this regard. In terms of the security dialogue, yes, security issues, again, is very important, and in Georgian case, we do it on a number of formats. Well, they are bilateral. We still consider that the cooperation in security field with the US is one of the major pillars, but in parallel, of course, building up this capacity with the European Union is important. The key reason for the security dialogue with the Europe is to bring this gap between the commonality of threat perception to a much lesser degree, because the threats that Georgia faces is the threats to the European security, and the overall what threatens the European Union is the Georgian threat. Same concerns the other countries as well. So that was the 3 points I would.
Any more comments?
I thought it's, anyway, I'll just briefly mention about strong, I definitely agree. Well, strong institutions, we talk about different things now, because actually first what Stas mentioned before in the previous panel is the fact that the set of institutions we have today in Ukraine, Moldova, etc., well, they are weak in the sense that basically we understand from perspective of good governance, etc., but they are strong in the sense that they actually do the functions that they are meant to do, especially by the elites. So, well, they perform what they are expected to perform from a perspective of people who actually control them. So this is, in a way, well, it's a bit, but the fact is that if basically we give today a lack of cyber weapons, you know, well, it doesn't solve the problems. So it's about the quality. So what actually are the set of formal and informal rules and norms that actually, which these institutions are built. So this is the key. And this is why actually what makes the distinction between the few Western countries and let's say post-Soviet space and so on and so forth. So it's about changing this, and this is a really rare and extremely difficult task and a different story. So I'll stop here.
Maybe just very briefly on the propaganda and the sanctions. I completely agree. The problem with the EU is that it has a lot of member states, not like the US, which have very different interests and very different dependence on Russia when it comes to both energy and trade. So it was a challenge to impose those economic sanctions, and it did affect especially some Central Eastern European countries trade-wise. And I completely agree that it will be, whether new sanctions will be imposed, it will be even more challenging as we go along. And when it comes to countering propaganda and fake news, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact question, but I think that first we also need to research and try to identify what this propaganda is and to what extent it is consumed. And maybe we can then learn more on how to counter it. The problem is that, especially on social media, it is changing very, very quickly. So if you react and delete some fake accounts, another 10 will just pop up. So I think this is something that we are still learning, unless you have a better.
Three sentences. On institutions, I think institutions cannot guarantee absolute security, but they can help to minimize the scale of attack. Sometimes they can prevent the attack, and sometimes they can raise the costs for attacker, and maybe in future to deter him or other powers. And I had it in my mind side of the way because it's both. Second, on propaganda, I think we have to move at the next level, and we have to think how we can use artificial intelligence in Eastern Partnership countries in order to dismantle the infrastructure, cyber or digital infrastructure used by hostile powers to spread messages. So switch from manually doing it into the AI. And the third thing, looking at the composition of our panel, it defies the narrative of Ukraine fatigue. We in the panel don't have a national from Ukraine, and even if Dmitro would join us, he would be still a minority. So basically, we have a panel of foreigners talking about Ukraine, representing different think tanks. So if somebody says that there is a fatigue, at least in the think tank, people don't believe there is no fatigue in our panels.
That's definitely something to be happy about, glad about. I'd like to wrap it up right now and just say a few more words. I think Ukraine is too big to fail, and it shouldn't fail, and we definitely know that it will not fail. We will do everything to help, because if you look at what is happening in Tunisia, what is happening in China, I think all of us, the ones who believe in this partnership, but also the Euro-Atlantic integration and the development and consolidation of our state as such, we do believe that Ukraine is extremely important for many reasons, and that's, I think, they talk about a different panel, why it's so important. So let's hope that that's going to be the case, and we are sure that it's going to be the case. I would like to wrap it up. Thank you for being with us throughout this time, and I would like to ask Angela if she has some housekeeping points to make, but I think it's the right time. Thank you once again.
Thank you for the great debate during all the session today. For your further program, for our foreign experts, please join Leonela in the lobby. She will tell you what we should do in a couple of minutes. Also, I would like to inform you that some of you are leaving early in the morning to go tomorrow, yes? I'm right, yes? And you will have on your emails detailed information with the driver, where we should expect them to come for you at the hotel or here at the BGO in the case of Octavian and Camille. Also, I would like to invite you to join tomorrow. We still have two sessions. One of them is dedicated to Romania, and the second one is dedicated to recommendation. And I will ask Irakli, in particular, to name a person from the audience to present your thoughts and recommendations for tomorrow's session. I know that Dmitry Shulka will join us, and he will represent Ukraine in this case. Yes, because Dmitry was living in the morning, so we have to find solutions, and those solutions have to be domestic. Thank you, and please join tomorrow for the last two sessions.
Thank you.